Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Guerric de Ternay, and welcome to a new episode of Unlock People's Potential. I'm sure you've been there, stuck in a brainstorming meeting that goes nowhere. You met up with your team to find new ideas, but quickly it appears that the discussion is going off topic. And this happens because your meeting is missing a structure. This is why I was so keen on inviting Will Woodward on Unlock People's Potential. Because Will Woodward is an innovation expert, and he's what he calls a facilitator. It means that his job is to guide teams with a structure during creative meetings. It's a bit like being a mediator, but for creativity. And trust me, he knows his craft very well. So together we talked about what is wrong with brainstorming and why it doesn't really work, what it means to be a facilitator, why is it so important to use a structure in a creative meeting, and what structure you should adopt. So, without further ado, welcome to today's episode. Hello, Will.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm good, Guerric.
So, I'm very pleased to have you on Unlock People's Potential. You're innovation experts. You have coached many people, helped them to do brainstorming, to go into creative meetings.
This is true.
And I really want to dig more into this topic of facilitating creativity with you.
Okay, well, I'll be delighted.
And so we've all been in this situation, where we're in a creative meeting, we want to talk about a specific problem, we want to find solutions, and quickly we go off topic.
Yeah.
What is happening here? Like, why we often go off topic?
So often people get together to have a creative meeting or to do something that they're going to call brainstorming. And actually, far too many of us actually learnt that term, brainstorming. We learnt it because we attended somebody else's brainstorm. And they learnt it because they attended somebody else's. And this goes on. And actually, the term, when it was originally created. It was created in the 40s by a chap called Alex Osborne, and it was highly structured. It was a really structured tool. And actually what we do now is we sort of sit down in a sort of a weak way. We just go, wow, so no idea is a bad idea. Okay, let's go. And then people start suggesting things that may be an idea, they may be only the beginnings of an idea. And what really happens is, instead of saying no idea is a bad idea, some of them get attention, some of them don't. The sort of king of the flip chart stands at the front, and maybe some of the things that get said get written down, but they get written down in one or two words, and afterwards those one or two words don't make any sense. And we've all had these experiences of sort of bad brainstorms. And I think it's given the title brainstorming a bad name, and it's unnecessary. If you do it really well, then it's highly structured and it's a highly effective thing. It's not the thing you need in every circumstance for creativity. It's a group activity, and actually lots of creativity happens when people are being quiet and working on their own. But it's one option, and it's an option that can be really effective, done well, and that's the thing. The structure is part of done well.
And so, Will, how do you do a good brainstorming session? What are the rules of brainstorming?
So if you want to play by the rules of brainstorming, you would have a very strong rule that there is to be no criticism of ideas, and in fact, no judgment at all. No level of that's a good idea and that's not. So you have to be quite careful to make that truly work. You can sort of demand of everybody present, don't say it, but the real request of everybody that's taking part in a brainstorm is to not think it. Now that's much harder, so I accept when I'm facilitating people that our brains, all of us, we're really good at critical thinking. Maybe we've got where we are today by being good at critical thinking. Maybe we're even evolved to be better at critical thinking. I don't know about that. But so suppressing that can be quite hard. So you have to be really tough on it. I always maintain that I can kill an idea with the smallest sound I know how to make, which is sort of... and actually even a roll of the eyes, which doesn't work on a podcast. So rule 1, no criticism of ideas, and that's no criticism. That's not even the role of the eyes. And rule 2 is equally important. It's actually you need tons of ideas. You need a large quantity of ideas. There's a real temptation to fall into what I call the trap of the first reasonable solution. That trap being, we've had an idea. It sounds like it might work. We could stop. Surely we've done what we came to do. We can go. Brilliant. We'll just go off and do that. Which, if the problem you're trying to solve is really well understood and familiar and everybody's an expert in that field, well, maybe you can. Maybe you didn't need creativity in the first place. And in that circumstance, you didn't need a brainstorm either. But actually, if what you require is some originality, if the problem is something that hasn't been solved in these terms before, or it hasn't been solved satisfactorily in these terms before, then that's when you need originality. And if you need originality, you need a large quantity of ideas. And of those ideas, tons of them will sound rubbish when they first come out. And it's okay for them to sound rubbish because they're just ideas. And tons of them will sound really familiar. And we're looking for originality, so surely we shouldn't have the familiar ideas, but actually you can't judge them, so the familiar ideas come out as well. And some of them sound really attractive, and avoiding the trap of the first reasonable solution, you still keep generating. You use the time that you've put aside to generate that large quantity of ideas, because that's really important. Of course, that middle batch, those wild and exaggerated ideas, things that are unfamiliar, probably sound unworkable at first. You can't tell whether they're going to be workable or not, so you have to pay them the same attention as the familiar. Now that's tough to ask people to do. So as a facilitator, you really have to get on to people and say, we're going to stick with this for a bit. And people are rolling their eyes and they're, well, but how can we stick with this idea that we know to be rubbish? Well, you don't know it's rubbish. You can't know it's rubbish because we're not using judgment in a brainstorm. So it's an interesting thing to ask of people, but actually all human beings are capable of it. It's rare that we ask for it.
And so you mentioned all of these rules of brainstorming, but one thing is, even when people are aware of them, they kind of forget to respect these rules.
Yeah.
So how can you make sure that the brainstorming session will go well because people respect the rules of brainstorming?
Well, let me make one suggestion that I use over and over again, which is, instead of it being the facilitator's job to spot when we're doing something that's unhelpful, I call it getting off track. Instead of it being the facilitator's job, how about it's everybody's job? How about if we had a common signal to say, maybe we're not doing creativity anymore? When somebody breaks the rules, what they're doing is using a level of judgment. So if we think that's happening, we need some sort of keyword or sound or signal that means maybe we're doing something that isn't creativity anymore. Maybe a level of judgment is creeping in. And it's really nice to be able to do that without it being an accusation. So instead of, oh no, Sharon's doing it wrong, and pointing at her and maybe throwing things at her, instead of that, if you can say, maybe we're getting off track by if you're in a really nice informal environment with people that trust each other and you can be a bit silly, that's helpful. So animal noises are great. And one of the groups I worked with chose a cow noise as being their signal. So if somebody wasn't sure whether someone was being judgmental, you'd hear this sort of and they were beginning a moo. Moo. Whereas when everybody spots that the guy who's always negative is being all negative now, everybody starts mooing him like a herd of bullocks, which is fun. But if I'm honest, that's sometimes even a little too silly for some of my clients. So then we use a keyword. One that's cropped up again and again is hat stand. The reason hat stand cropped up was because I was using the work of Dr. Edward de Bono, 6 thinking hats. Now his concept is that there are 6 different modes of thinking, and one of those is creativity. And so if you're wearing the green hat, that's his analogy, you can wear these different thinking hats. The green hat is for creativity. If you're wearing the green hat and one of the other hats start creeping in, that's unhelpful. So that's where we're using the keyword for that. So we decided the keyword could be hat stand. So anyone can say it, at any time. And it doesn't mean they're accusing someone else of doing it wrong. It just means as a group we might be getting off track.
And so, Will, you're a facilitator. You mentioned that sometimes a brainstorming session requires to have someone who's going to facilitate the creative process. What is it like to be a facilitator?
Being the facilitator, I think it's my job to make everybody's life easier. Sadly, that means in the short term, some people see it as I'm making their life more difficult. So I, for instance, will hold them to using a structure within the meeting. And if they get outside of that structure, I'll suggest that we're off track and we'll guide them back onto it. Now, that can feel quite painful for participants sometimes, but my commitment is to the end result. And indeed, when you look at who's there and why they're committed to the end result. So the way I'm making their life easier is we're getting to the result more easily, more quickly, more effectively. In the case of brainstorming, that result is we have a pile of original ideas. In the case of other meetings I facilitate, it can be that we've, had a good, at a really simple level actually, that we've had a good team update, but we've only used 15 minutes to do it instead of the 2 3/4 hours that get used every Thursday. To no good effect. So, yeah, I think the facilitator's job is to make everyone's life easy, but it may not feel like it sometimes.
So, Will, if you have to coach someone to become a facilitator and help his team to be more creative, what would you recommend?
I think the first thing I'd recommend is read some stuff on the subject, and I'd point you in the direction of Edward de Bono's 6 Thinking Hats, because that is really helpful to understand the sort of 5 other modes of thinking which aren't creativity, because then you can describe to the people you're facilitating how to turn down the volume on those and focus solely on the creative mode. So I'd recommend that, and actually there's some good videos and summaries out there of that book. So if you're not someone who enjoys picking up a book, then you can actually get the concept pretty quickly. I would recommend the whole book because it's an easy read, and it's nicely structured in that you can you get the concept very early on in the book. You can read the chapter summaries to remind you of what each of the 6 thinking hats are. But actually it's full of examples that de Bono uses of how those 6 thinking hats have fitted into work for people in the past. So I'd say that's a good starting point. Another book I'd recommend would be Sticky Wisdom, which is written by a creative agency called What If. Sticky Wisdom's sort of a handbook of creative facilitation, so I'm heavily influenced by that one as well.
And in terms of facilitating arises because you need a structure. So any creative meeting requires to adopt a structure. And why is it so important?
Well, the thing that goes wrong with creative meetings is the same thing that goes wrong with all the other types of meetings. It's you're trying to do too many different things and do them all at once. And with all the people who could possibly contribute there. And actually, it'd be so much more helpful if you could pick the one thing that you need to do at a time, just get the right people in the room to do it, and know when it's done, know when the outcome you're trying to reach, you've reached it. So if you've got a route to get to that outcome, a defined structure that means that everybody knows what's meant to be happening at a given moment and how they can best contribute to that, then that structure is made up of sort of the path we'll take, the route, and the traffic regulations that we'll observe along the way. So to give you an example, let's stay with a creative conversation. Then you might have a route which goes A, we're going to get very clear on what the problem is. B, we're going to share and build on ideas. And C, we're going to decide which ideas we're going to, which things need researching to progress those ideas. So I can give you a bit more detail on that if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
So that first stage that I called A, gaining clarity on the problem and actually how wide the scope you have to solve it is. So you'll be talking about, and during this, the rules of the game are no ideas yet, no assumptions allowed. You know, everything that's stated needs to be sort of a provable fact. We'll deliberately challenge commonly held beliefs, the things that we believe but we don't know why we believe them. We might do that by continually asking why. Why is that the case? Why does that occur? And so you can have a really interesting conversation capturing why the problem occurs, what the impacts are, And actually, if the problem as it's first described, when you talk about it, could it turn out to be more than one problem, one on top of another or two that are connected, then it's really helpful to separate them and say, well, okay, so that's one problem, and here's another, and maybe there's a third that's interacting with it, and you can choose to solve those problems separately.
So it's really going back to the idea of defining a problem very specifically. You wrote an article and you at some point quoted the philosopher John Dewey saying that a problem well stated is a problem half solved. And so what are other techniques to define a problem?
I'll give you an example. I think my probably my first stop when I'm trying to define the problem well is that continual asking of why. And people who study methods for business improvement will give this a name and tell you about its Japanese origins, but actually just simply asking why. So when someone says, well, the I don't know, the process keeps falling over and all these letters get lost, like, well, why do they get lost? Well, because when that particular part of the process doesn't work, Margaret always puts them in a box, but she doesn't necessarily tell anyone where she's put the box. Okay, why do they have to go into a box? Why aren't they dealt with straight away? Oh, well, because we always have to wait for Dave to be in, and Dave actually is the one who can deal with it when that unusual circumstance happens. And so by asking why, you've suddenly discovered there are two different people involved. They're doing things that they sort of have to make up on the spot. We can ask why 5 more times, and there's a very good chance we'll keep learning more. In fact, you know when to stop asking why when the answers become tedious.
And so, Will, in terms of creativity and like kind of boosting the creative power of a team, what do you recommend that the team should do if they want to be really, really creative and solve problems in a more original way?
Okay, let's go back to that example structure I was talking about. So if you focused on the problem and you've done sort of stop A along the route, then stop B is the build and share of ideas. So this is the main part of why you've come together. So it's obviously going to be the biggest part of the meeting, if we'll call it that. And any size group, whoever's going to be there, is going to be better at building original ideas when they're 100% focused on doing that. So that means... So that means choosing not to care whether the ideas are going to be useful or not, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a hard thing to ask of people, but truly essential. They've got to truly pay no attention to whether the ideas in the long run will really add value or whether they're going to turn out to be just something that was said in a creative session. So this is where you need some more traffic regulations. So number one, the facts just don't matter. So questions about whether something could technically work, whether it could even be done that way, are irrelevant. They're truly irrelevant. Concerns about risks associated with if you did that idea, this might happen, that might happen. You have to suppress that. It's really important that we're not discussing the fact of the matter or the risks. We've really got to try and rein in even our gut feel reaction. Oh my God, I've heard ideas like that so often and they're always rubbish. And you have to rein that in and say, we're not going to have that conversation. I'm not going to share it. I'm even going to try and make sure my face doesn't show it. So number one, the facts don't matter. Number two, let's build the ideas together. It's so much more useful. Instead of I stand up and I say, I've got this idea, and I position it as my idea, and everybody has to listen to me telling you about my idea. Actually, instead of one person owning the idea, then what we need is everybody committing to contributing to every new thought that comes up. So yes, I may have been the first, but unlikely to be me, because I'm not that creative. Whoever spoke first might be the person you think of as owning the idea, but we need to make it ours very quickly. So to do that, everybody has to really commit to understanding what the thought means, what that idea is, so they can contribute, so that they can add their own richness to the idea. So we're building together, and number 3 rule, ideas don't need to compete. So the temptation is you're talking about one idea and someone goes, oh, I've got an even better idea. But there's an assumption buried in that. The assumption is that we understand the value of the first idea and we understand the value of the second idea. But to do that, you would have had to use some judgment, and we're not using judgment when we're doing creativity. So instead of having ideas competing in that conversation about whether it's a better idea or not, we can say, well, it's just another idea. So we'll continue to deal with the one that's already on the table. You make a note of the other things that have occurred to you that might turn out to be the next idea, and we'll come back to them. We'll come back to them in the order they're generated. So we won't. And this is, again, it's a tricky thing to negotiate. Is to say we're going to stick with the one idea until it's fully captured. It's not 2 words on a flip chart. Maybe we'll draw a picture of it. Maybe we'll have some words as well. But each idea gets that level of attention before you put it aside and say, okay, we know what that one is. It's well captured. We'll put it aside. What's the next one that's on hold? What's the next one that's already occurred to somebody that we weren't allowed to talk about? And then that way the ideas, instead of competing, are just one after another. And in fact, they tend to follow on. So if you're worried about running dry, you don't run dry when you focus on them one at a time, because each one generates more. So that's number 3. The ideas don't need to compete. And number 4, capture everything. Instead of that the king of the flip chart deciding what he'll write down because he thinks it's reasonable. Actually, because we're collaborating to capture the whole of what the idea was and all of our contributions to it, we'll end up with a real moment in the spotlight for each idea, a real build on each idea, and those creative conversations, instead of segueing from one thought to another really quickly, it slows things down. It seems like, but Will, isn't that going to take us much longer? Actually, it's going to get you the outcome much faster. It's just that the outcome is you've got this wide array of original ideas. You could have had a faster meeting, but would you have had as wider array of interesting ideas? Maybe not, in which case you didn't get the outcome. You think you've been really busy, you think you've been really fast, but if you haven't got the outcome, you've just used some time. So that's 4 rules for that middle section of building on the ideas. The facts don't matter. Let's build it together. Ideas don't need to compete, and capture everything.
And so we mentioned a lot creative meetings, but in order for a meeting to take place, you need team members. How do you build this team, and who do you choose to be part of the team when you have a creative meeting?
That's a great question. It's going to be helpful to people to hear an answer to that question, because I think everybody defaults to, well, we need to get the project team in the room. We need to get the decision makers involved. We need to get the stakeholders. We won't be able to go anywhere unless we get Brian involved at this stage. And that can be true, but actually I think if you're trying for creativity, who is present, what their position is, might not be as helpful as you think. So maybe what we need is people who are willing to be creative, people who are willing to put their full brain power on solving that problem, and even people who don't understand the problem. They can be particularly helpful. Someone who hasn't heard the problem before, who isn't buried in your reality. I've worked in the past with a whole bunch of people who are very technology focused. Sometimes a technology problem is best solved by trying to explain the problem in non-techie terms to someone who wouldn't understand the technical terms even if they did, and hearing their responses. And that turns out to be true whether your expertise is road mending or software coding or mowing lawns. So it's not about getting the obvious people in the room necessarily. Sometimes it's about getting some of the non-obvious people in the room. I do one particular type of project with clients who, when they're facing a really big issue for their industry, we gather a group of experts who are experts in anything but their industry. That may seem like an odd thing to do because those experts are totally unaware of how the problem has been attacked before, they tend to take a new direction. Now we try to find experts who, and we're very successful at finding experts who have an analogous expertise. So if the problem we were trying to solve was something to do with, well, I'll give you a really good example from the past. I was working with a transition to live team for a bank. Their job was making sure that we were doing software releases to the live environment which didn't bring down the bank. Pretty important stuff. And there was a real bottleneck at that point. The organisation could write far more code than it could release, and they wanted to re-engineer their transition to live process so that it wasn't a bottleneck anymore. And they actually went on a visit to a brewery, which is always a good excuse, isn't it? They went on a visit to a brewery, and they saw the bottling plant at the brewery, and they met the change team for the bottling plant, because they had to bring in new lines, new products to be bottled without stopping the plant. And so they had an analogous problem to solve, so they were able to take inspiration from the solutions that they used in bringing a new product line into the bottling plant for their transition to live process for releasing software for the bank. People who know me will recognise that story.
So at that point, Will, I think we gave, you gave much great advice about how to be more creative, and I guess all of our listeners will become super creative thanks to you. And once you've been very creative and came up with a lot of ideas, how do you select the right ideas?
Right. So the third part of that structure I introduced before, part A, clarity of the problem. Part B, share and build the ideas. Part C actually would be decide what to research. So after you're left with this massive pile of diverse and original ideas, and maybe it is time to start caring about the facts again. Earlier on, it was important that the facts didn't matter. We need to bring them back. And so in that stack of ideas, there are probably plenty of things which, for us to move forward with that idea, we would need to know. And actually, you can make, fairly quickly, looking at all the ideas generated, make one list of all the things we would need to know to be able to use judgment on those ideas. And I'd suggest postponing judgment a little longer until that research is done. So there would be facts that you can find out, research that you can go and put your hands on, and actually this is a really nice time to get people involved who weren't included in the creative session. So you can start asking for feedback from other colleagues, other stakeholders, people that weren't in your creative session, but that might have some useful input. Now, of course, they'll probably be quite judgmental, but there'll be a mixture of that feedback. And in fact, the reason, Guerric, the reason you and I met was because I was using Includer to do that.
And so, yeah, as you mentioned, I think the best thing to do is actually when there is a lot of uncertainty about the ideas that you have and which should be the ones that you will work on, kind of leveraging the know-how of the entire team, and as you mentioned, getting a big picture thanks to a diversity of backgrounds. And how do you approach this idea of just making sure that you've looked at the ideas from many different perspectives?
I think in moving forward and trying to start to select the ideas and understand more about where the value really lies, it's helpful to use De Bono's work again, so you can look at the idea, each individual idea under his different thinking hats. So there's a thinking hat, the yellow hat for value and benefits. You can look under the black hat, you can check for risks and issues and what you'd need to be careful of if you're going to use that idea. You've already been using the white hat by doing some research into what you would need to know to go forward with those ideas. And actually, you can bring back your gut feel. You can use his red hat, which is about emotion, and you can use your gut feel to say, how do I feel about this idea? And by creating each of those lists for each idea, you start to get a feel for, does the idea have lots of value and very few risks? Well, then it's definitely a goer, isn't it? If the idea has lots of risks and not very much value, okay, so we're probably not very attracted to it. I'm always interested in the ones that have lots of risks and problems associated with them and lots of value associated with them, because I think there's a really great indicator there that idea needs some more work, because you can go back to creativity and say, let's take this idea and fix it. Let's keep the nub, the concept, let's keep that. But if we can tweak the idea so some of the risks aren't as likely, or they can be mitigated against, maybe we've got something new here, something that other people would have found unattractive, but we can fix it so that it's usable to us. So I'm in judging the ideas, I start to bring back the judgment by using each one of De Bono's 6 thinking hats one at a time.
Will, thanks so much for coming to this show and telling us more about how to be super creative and select ideas. I guess, and I'm actually sure that all of our listeners will become more creative, more innovative, and thanks to you, finally get a good brainstorming session.
It was very nice talking to you, Guerric. I'll leave you with my final message, which I think there's a theme been running through what we're talking about. That the route you take and the traffic regulations along the route, they give you the structure that I think makes your creative session better. So you know what? If that's all anybody took from this conversation, they'd be very welcome to it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Will.
Cheers, Guerric. Goodbye.
Hey guys. Thanks for listening to this episode of Unlock People's Potential. This podcast was brought to you by Contriber. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. Let us know what you think. You can find the show notes on our blog, blog.contriber.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope you've been inspired to become a great leader and to unlock people's potential.